The River of Ruin, a true tale of the Great Molasses Flood. Hook. It did not arrive with the roar of a hurricane, nor the grinding crash of an earthquake. It came instead with a sound like a freight train, a colossal, sloshing wave of brown, sticky doom that engulfed Boston's North End at an estimated 35 feet high, traveling at 35 miles per hour. It shattered an elevated train, tore buildings from their foundations, and choked the life out of 21 people and injured 150 more. This was not water, not oil, not lava. It was molasses. Pure, sweet, dark, fermenting molasses. A sugary, true-life apocalypse in the heart of a major American city, an industrial tragedy of such unbelievable absurdity that for over a century, the very air in Boston's North End still carries a faint, sickly sweet scent on a hot summer day. This is the true story of January 15th, 1919, when a wave of syrup became one of the strangest, deadliest, and most legally complex disasters in American history. Chapter 1. The Sweetest Hour Before the Storm. The air on Commercial Street, January 15th, 1919, was unseasonably warm. A freakish January thaw had settled over Boston, pulling the temperatures into the low 40s after weeks of bitter cold. For the residents of the North End, a vibrant, crowded, predominantly Italian-American neighborhood nestled close to the waterfront, it was a welcome, if strange, reprieve. 2 blocks away, at the corner of Commercial and Copp's Hill Terrace, a behemoth of a structure dominated the view. A vast, steel-plated tank, 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter, belonging to the Purity Distilling Company. It was an ugly, riveted cylinder, holding a precious cargo, nearly 2.3 million gallons of raw cane molasses. To understand the menace that tank represented, you must first understand the purpose of its syrupy contents. This was not the kitchen syrup used for gingerbread and pecan pie. This was industrial-grade, thick as tar blackstrap molasses, the byproduct of sugar refining. And in 1919 America, it was a strategic wartime commodity. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol (USIA) Company, was churning out ethanol, or industrial alcohol. This alcohol, derived from fermenting the molasses, had 2 critical uses. First, as a precursor for smokeless gunpowder and other munitions for the ongoing World War I effort, and second, as a product they desperately wanted to rush to market before the impending national ban on alcohol, a little legal maneuver called Prohibition. The war had only just ended in November, but the massive tank had been filled and refilled since 1915, a relentless cycle that masked a fatal flaw. Antonio D'Estasio, a foreman for the Boston Elevated Railway, leaned against a pole beneath the elevated train tracks, stamping his feet in the unusual warmth. He was a man of meticulous routine, and at 12:40 p.m. he was precisely 5 minutes into his half-hour lunch break. Antonio had emigrated from Naples just before the turn of the century, and the noise of the L train clattering overhead, the smell of salted cod and tomato sauce from the nearby tenements, and even the faint, sour-sweet stench of the molasses tank had all become the sounds and smells of home. He hated that tank. Not just for its ugliness, but for its arrogance. It had been built hastily in 1915, not far from the docks where the great lumbering molasses tankers, like the SS East Boston, would unload their cargo fresh from the cane fields of Cuba and Puerto Rico. Neighbors had complained from the start. "It sings to the sea," an old Italian woman had once told Antonio, pointing a withered finger at the tank. She meant the low metallic groan that the structure emitted when its contents were cooling or expanding. But Antonio knew better. In 1916, when the tank was first filled, there had been a terrifying series of cracks. Arthur Gell, the supervising engineer for Purity, a man with no prior structural engineering experience, had merely painted the tank brown, the same color as the molasses, to disguise the leaks. Gel's bosses at USIA were ruthless businessmen, focused on maximizing profit, not engineering integrity. They had scoffed at the structural plans, calling the required quarter-inch steel walls over-engineered. They demanded a thinner skin. Antonio and his fellow railway workers saw the leaks every day. They watched rivulets of thick, dark molasses weep from the seams, collecting in pools at the base, which neighborhood children would scoop up for a treat until the company began cleaning it up more regularly. The smell was cloying, almost suffocating on humid days. "It's a sickness, that sweet smell," Antonio muttered, taking a bite of his bread and sausage. Inside the firehouse of Engine 31, located just across the street, a group of firefighters were sharing their noontime meal. Among them was Lieutenant Stephen Clough, a Boston native and an old hand who had grown up watching the North End transform. He was laughing at a story told by firefighter George Leahy about a particularly disastrous attempt at making Italian wedding soup. Firehouse 31 was a busy place, but on this mild, sunny day, it was unusually peaceful. The men were relaxed, their heavy uniforms slung on pegs. They had endured the smell of the tank for years, an omnipresent, fermenting perfume they had learned to ignore. Suddenly, a strange, low-frequency vibration began to rattle the windows. It was deeper than the L train, more resonant. "What in God's name is that?" Clough asked, setting down his coffee mug. It sounded like a massive, distant metallic sheet being struck. A gong, a doom bell, or perhaps a cannon shot. Miles away, at the USIA headquarters, Arthur Gell was relieved. He was done with the molasses tank, done with the headaches, done with the construction crews and the constant demands for faster production. He had a vacation planned, a break he sorely needed. He had performed a peremptory safety test on the tank only the day before, topping it up with a new shipment from Cuba. He hadn't bothered to fill it with water first, the proper engineering procedure, to check for leaks under true pressure. It would have meant wasting precious production time. His job, as he saw it, was to keep the molasses flowing and the industrial alcohol profits rolling in. The tank was filled, and today, Gell was simply signing the paperwork for the next transfer. He had ignored the warnings of his own crew. Sam Mason, a steelworker, had pointed out that the tank structure was visibly stressed, with the rivets popping and the metal groaning audibly. Mason was paid to weld, not worry, and Gell had dismissed him, noting that the tank was only temporary, designed to be disassembled once the immediate rush for alcohol was over. What neither Gell nor anyone else at USIA fully understood was the thermodynamics of their product. The molasses was not stable. The massive quantity, coupled with the change in temperature, cold when loaded, now warming quickly, had spurred a runaway fermentation process. This created huge quantities of carbon dioxide gas inside the tank. The dome, a weak point, was under an extreme, uncalculated internal pressure. The 2.3 million gallons of dense liquid, weighing approximately 26 million pounds, was pressing on the sides, but the gas pressure was the invisible hand pushing outwards against the already strained thin steel plates. The very sweetness of the product was its own fatal accelerant. Antonio D'Estasio looked up from his sandwich, the strange, low-frequency vibration now turning into a rapid, rising cacophony of tearing steel. It was the sound of a drum skin rupturing. Antonio witnessed, in a horrifying flash of motion, the impossible. The great squat tank on the corner of Commercial Street seemed to unzip. The rivets along the lower seams, stressed beyond their yield point by the combination of external static pressure and internal gas pressure, let go. In a chain reaction that took less than a second, the steel plates buckled and tore. It sounded like a single monstrous whomp, like a thunderclap right over his head, followed by a liquid cannonade that instantly overwhelmed the noise of the city. The massive steel cylinder exploded outward. The dome flew 200 feet into the air, landing in a twisted heap in the harbor. Shrapnel, heavy curved plates of inch-thick steel, flew in every direction, scything through the air. And then, the river.
The molasses, a dense, viscous liquid roughly 40% heavier than water, was released with the force of an uncontained bomb. A wave of the sticky substance, estimated by survivors to be between 15 and 35 feet high, surged north toward the waterfront and west into the crowded streets. "My God!" Antonio screamed, dropping his food. He saw the first victim, a teamster named Martin Clough, no relation to the firefighter, driving a heavy wagon near the tank. The waves struck the horse and cart with the blunt force of a battering ram, flipping them end over end and crushing the driver beneath the wagon and the rising tide of molasses. Antonio was momentarily sheltered by the thick steel pillar of the L-track, but the sheer volume of the molasses was unbelievable. It hit the support pillar with a massive sploosh, and Antonio felt the air itself turn heavy, thick, and brown. The force of the wave was not just momentum, it was hydrostatic pressure. It stripped the nearby tenements, 4 and 5 stories high, right off their foundations. The firehouse, Engine 31, was next. Inside Engine 31, Lieutenant Clough and his men barely had time to react. "It's a flood!" Leahy yelled, mistaking the dark liquid for tidal water. But before they could run, the first wave, a solid, moving wall, slammed into the brick building. The firehouse was a modern structure, but it stood no chance. The 26 million pounds of molasses, moving at 35 miles per hour, instantly shattered the front facade and drove the entire building 2 feet backward. Lieutenant Clough was thrown against the back wall, momentarily stunned. He opened his eyes to a world of brown. Molasses poured in, filling the ground floor in seconds, submerging the firefighting apparatus and trapping his men. It was not a quick submersion. The liquid was thick, slow to fill air pockets, but impossibly powerful. It caught George Leahy, pulling him into a corner and pinning him beneath a fallen beam. The molasses invaded his mouth, his nose, his ears. It coated his eyes, blinding him. He struggled, but the density of the syrup, combined with the debris, made movement nearly impossible. He was drowning in sugar. Outside, Antonio stumbled away from the L column, finding himself ankle-deep in the flow. He looked across the street toward the firehouse, now a crumpled, drowning mess, and saw another sight that would haunt him for life. A young girl, Maria Di Giovanni, only 10 years old, was playing with a kitten on the steps of her family's tenement. The molasses had reached her as a creeping, overwhelming tide. She screamed, a high, thin sound instantly muffled by the liquid as the molasses trapped her legs. The problem was the viscosity. The molasses was so thick that once it entangled a body, it acted like a sticky, inescapable quicksand. With every struggle, the victim became more trapped, the syrup filling every crease and pocket, solidifying their weight. Antonio tried to run to her, but the sheer force of the current knocked him down. He scrambled up, his hands covered in the slimy, warm substance, and saw Maria disappear beneath the brown surface. The disaster was not just the force of the initial impact. It was the sickening, slow, suffocating aftermath. The north end was being remade. The streets, docks, and basements were filling with the syrupy tide. The sheer weight of the molasses had buckled sections of the L-track, creating a looming danger for the next passing train. As Antonio looked back at the remains of the tank, now just a jagged ring of base steel, he knew this was no accident. The sweetness had turned to poison, and the neighborhood, his home, was buried beneath a tidal wave of corporate greed. The search for survivors was only just beginning, a horrifying, sticky slog through a scene that defied all understanding. No one could have imagined that the fight for survival would take days, and the legal battle for justice would take years, establishing a precedent that would change the very face of American industrial law forever. The river of ruin had just begun to flow. Chapter 2. The Brown Tide.
The immediate aftermath was a scene ripped from a nightmare, a grotesque blend of slapstick comedy and horrific tragedy. The explosion had occurred at 12:41 p.m. For those who survived the initial wave, the next few minutes were a bewildering struggle against a slow, heavy, inescapable foe. The molasses was not just liquid, it was a physical obstacle. Its high viscosity meant that once it hit, it clung, it bound, and it solidified. As the afternoon chill began to return to the air, the syrup cooled, making it even thicker and stickier. Antonio D'Estasio scrambled onto the highest intact piece of cobblestone he could find, near the wreckage of the L-pillar. He was alive, but the world around him had become a vast, churning bog. Every street, every alleyway was submerged under several feet of the brown muck. The air, initially filled with the sound of the explosion, now contained a chilling mix of frantic cries, the distressed whinnying of horses, and the low, bubbling sound of molasses settling. He saw the victims. A group of longshoremen enjoying a dockside card game in a small shed had been instantly entombed. The shed was merely compressed into a flat layer of kindling and sugar. Inside the wreckage, bodies were impossible to spot. They were simply part of the glutinous ruin. The Purity Distilling Company's bottling plant, a substantial building nearby, was sheared completely off its granite foundation and floated over 200 feet before collapsing onto a nearby house. The people inside, mostly clerical workers, were crushed by the structural failure, not just the molasses. The trapped and the rescuers. In the chaos, ordinary citizens became immediate heroes. The North End was one of Boston's most densely populated neighborhoods, and people poured from the tenements and businesses, only to be stopped short by the molasses. They quickly discovered the difficulty of rescue. To walk in the molasses was like wading through wet cement. Every step was a battle against suction. A squad of sailors from the U.S. Navy's training ship Nantucket, docked a short distance away, were among the first organized responders. They arrived armed with ropes and shovels, expecting a typical waterfront fire or perhaps a burst water main. They were confronted with a disaster unlike any they had trained for. Lieutenant Commander William H. Murphy, leading the naval contingent, ordered his men to tie themselves together. They formed human chains, stepping gingerly into the syrup. They learned quickly pulling a body free was incredibly difficult. The molasses was so heavy that it required 3 or 4 strong men to drag one small trapped person free. One of the men the sailor saved was a baker, Gino Massaro, who was caught with his bicycle in the street. The wave had thrown him down, and the molasses immediately sealed him to the ground. He was conscious, but completely immobilized. His struggles had only driven him deeper. The sailors managed to loop a rope around him and haul him out, covered head to toe in the sticky fluid, gasping for breath. The molasses was inches from his mouth. Antonio, still clutching the railway pillar, watched the desperate attempts to reach Engine 31. The firehouse was a wreck. Its apparatus, the beautiful steam engine and the hook and ladder, were submerged. Inside, Lieutenant Clough found himself in a terrifying vertical space. He had been thrown high and was trapped between the back wall and the ceiling beams just above the waterline of the molasses. He could hear his men struggling beneath him. "Leahy! George, can you hear me?" Clough shouted. There was a gurgling, muffled sound. George Leahy was pinned beneath a heavy wooden truss, his head just above the syrup, but sinking slowly. "Can't move, Chief," Leahy choked out. "The pressure." The pressure was immense. Not only was the surrounding liquid incredibly dense, but the debris within it, bricks, steel shards, heavy furniture, made the struggle impossible. Molasses, it turned out, was a near-perfect drowning medium. It was too thick to spit out, too dense to swim through, and its density exacerbated the internal pressure on the body, making breathing even difficult for those whose heads were above the surface. Clough managed to force his way along the narrow space near the ceiling, reaching the point where he could see Leahy's desperate, molasses-coated face. "Hold on, son! We're getting you out!" But Clough couldn't budge the beam. He could only comfort the struggling man until the first wave of rescuers, local men with axes and a terrifying determination, began chopping a hole through the side of the firehouse, their tools ringing against the brick. It took over an hour of relentless chopping and digging and the slow, arduous removal of the molasses by bucket and shovel before they could reach Leahy. By the time he was pulled free, he was barely breathing, suffering from broken ribs and acute respiratory distress. The scientific struggle. The cleanup was almost as dangerous as the disaster itself. The sheer volume of the molasses meant that the north end was essentially coated in a thick brown blanket. The first few days were focused on the terrifying task of recovery. Rescue workers faced an unprecedented scene. The wreckage was both structural and organic. People and animals, once they had cooled in the molasses, became incredibly difficult to locate. The fluid made every surface slippery and treacherous. The rescue effort was immediately hampered by the fact that the fire hoses, called in to wash away the molasses, barely made any difference. High-pressure water simply dispersed the syrup slightly, but the water mixed with the sugar to create a new problem: sticky, diluted molasses that flowed into basements and sewers, gluing everything in its path. Teams began using shovels, steam hoses brought in from industrial plants, and sand. They had to dig manually through the debris in the molasses to find victims. The density of the substance meant bodies were not easily buoyant. They were submerged, entombed in their final positions. As the days passed, the temperature dropped and the molasses hardened further. This turned the search effort into an excavation. The north end began to smell intensely. The fermentation continued, now in the open air, creating a powerful, boozy and sour stench that permeated the entire district. For weeks, the city was draped in the sickening odor of industrial-grade rum. In total, it took 4 days to find all the human victims. It took nearly 10 days to clear the streets well enough for traffic to resume. The cleanup efforts, employing hundreds of men, took nearly 6 months and required continuously pumping seawater into the streets to wash the remnants of the brown tide back into Boston Harbor. Even so, the harbor water remained brown for weeks. But the cleanup of the physical damage was only the beginning. The unprecedented nature of the accident demanded a reckoning. Who was responsible for this unbelievable, sugary catastrophe? The answer would lead to one of the most exhaustive, technically complex, and consequential legal battles in American history.
Chapter 3: The Search for Blame and the Invisible Hand. The days following the molasses flood were marked by civic outrage and a profound sense of disbelief. How could 21 lives and millions of dollars in property have been destroyed by a substance as benign as sugar? The victims and the city of Boston immediately looked for someone to blame, and the finger pointed squarely at the United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA Company, and its subsidiary, Purity Distilling. USIA, a powerful and politically connected corporation, had a ready-made defense: anarchist sabotage. The sabotage defense. In 1919, America was gripped by the Red Scare. The Russian Revolution was fresh in the news, labor movements were gaining power, and anarchist bombings were a real threat. USIA seized upon this fear, hiring lawyers and investigators to craft a narrative that deflected corporate responsibility. Their lead investigator, Frank P. Mott, began circulating the theory that the tank had been bombed by Italian anarchists, possibly targeting the nearby docks or the federal buildings. This theory was presented to the press and immediately took hold among some of the city's elite. It offered a clean, external explanation for an otherwise inexplicable disaster. It was a political act, not a corporate failure. However,
The local Italian community, already reeling from the devastation, viewed this accusation as a malicious smear. Many of the dead and injured were Italian immigrants or their children. The theory crumbled under simple scrutiny. There was no crater consistent with a high explosive bomb, and witnesses reported the sound as a tear or a rupture, not an explosion. The engineering reckoning. The city of Boston, representing the victims, countered with a mountain of evidence pointing to structural negligence. This legal confrontation, USIA v. City of Boston, would become the longest and most complex civil suit in Massachusetts history, taking over 6 years to resolve. It was, in essence, the first major American lawsuit to hinge almost entirely on expert engineering testimony. The task of proving corporate negligence fell largely to Hugh W. Ogden, the court-appointed auditor who oversaw the entire process of gathering evidence and hearing testimony. Ogden was a meticulous, unbiased observer, and he sought the highest authority in structural engineering, Professor George F. Swain of Harvard and MIT. Swain's investigation was groundbreaking. He treated the ruptured tank not as a simple accident, but as a catastrophic engineering failure. His team meticulously gathered pieces of the tank's steel shell. Using metallurgical and chemical analysis, cutting-edge science for the time, Swain determined the fatal flaws. The steel was too thin. The original plans, hastily approved by Arthur Gell's bosses, called for steel plate that was too thin to safely hold 2.3 million gallons of a liquid 40% denser than water. The rivets were faulty. The riveting technique was poor. The holes for the rivets were not properly aligned, and the rivets themselves were brittle and weak. Witnesses later testified that the plates had been hammered into alignment, a practice that introduced massive stress into the metal before the tank was even filled. No water test. Swain proved that the tank had never been filled with water, which would have revealed the leaks and structural weaknesses under load before molasses was stored. The thermodynamics of destruction. Professor Swain also solved the mystery of the tank's sudden, violent failure. The unseasonable warm weather in January was not just a coincidence, it was the catalyst for the final rupture. The molasses had been cold when loaded into the tank. The sudden temperature jump to the 40s created two simultaneous deadly conditions. Thermal expansion, the molasses expanded, increasing the static pressure on the thin walls. And runaway fermentation. The heat drastically accelerated the yeast in the molasses, rapidly generating massive amounts of carbon dioxide gas. This trapped gas created a deadly internal pressure against the poorly constructed dome and the weak seams. The tank literally popped like a cheap balloon, releasing its contents with explosive force. The conclusion was inescapable. The disaster was not the result of a political conspiracy or an act of God. It was the direct, predictable consequence of shoddy construction, corporate penny pinching, and a total disregard for basic engineering safety standards. Arthur Gell, the supervisor, testified that he, quote, knew nothing of the engineering requirements and had merely followed orders to rush construction and keep costs down. His superiors, focused solely on the profits of manufacturing industrial alcohol before Prohibition took effect, had knowingly cut corners. The tide of molasses had now been fully explained by science. It was a viscous corporate blunder flowing directly from the cost-benefit analysis of USIA's balance sheet. The court's eventual ruling would change the legal landscape for industrial accountability in America forever.
Chapter 4. The Legal Tsunami and the Birth of Modern Safety. The court case that followed, officially filed as a collective action on behalf of the victims and the City of Boston against USIA, was a monumental affair.
It took 6 years, from 1919 to 1925, involved over 125 separate lawsuits, and required the testimony of nearly 3,000 witnesses, including dozens of highly paid engineers, scientists, and metallurgists. It became the legal crucible that tested the modern American concept of corporate negligence. The auditor and the precedent. The entire case hinged on the findings of Hugh W. Ogden, the court-appointed auditor. Ogden, a respected legal figure, was given the extraordinary task of functioning as a sort of forensic investigator, synthesizing all the complex scientific and testimonial evidence before the case went to a jury. His role was to cut through the corporate spin and the emotional outrage to establish factual responsibility. The central legal argument revolved around the concept of due care. Did USIA exercise the reasonable care and judgment expected of a corporation dealing with a known hazardous material in a densely populated urban area? The corporation's defense continued to lean on the act of God or anarchist bombing theories, attempting to paint the disaster as an unpredictable external event. But Ogden's meticulous report, which ran hundreds of pages, systematically dismantled their claims, relying heavily on Professor Swain's engineering analysis. Ogden's final ruling was a landmark decision for industrial law. USIA was found fully responsible for the disaster. He concluded that the construction of the tank was so palpably insufficient and unsafe that the company should have known it would fail. He cited the lack of a proper foundation, the shoddy riveting, the dangerously thin steel plates, and the failure to conduct a simple preliminary water test. He pointed out that the company's insistence on speed and cheapness directly led to the catastrophic failure. The financial and social justice. Following Ogden's definitive report, USIA faced the inevitable. Rather than prolonging the agonizing process with appeals, they agreed to an out-of-court settlement with the victims. The total settlement amounted to roughly $1 million, an enormous sum in 1925, equivalent to tens of millions today. While no amount of money could replace the lives lost, the process was a monumental victory for the common citizen against the ruthless power of big business. The settlement allocated funds to the families of the deceased and the injured, compensating them for medical bills, lost wages, and pain and suffering. Crucially, the legacy of the case extended beyond the monetary compensation. The Molasses flood case set a foundational legal precedent in the United States, cementing the principle that engineers and manufacturers were legally required to submit structural plans and calculations for approval by qualified third parties before building large industrial structures. This disaster directly led to the implementation of new rigorous building codes across major American cities, particularly those concerning large-scale storage tanks, utility infrastructure, and industrial facilities. Prior to the flood, many industrial projects operated under virtually no regulatory oversight. The brown tide of molasses forced American jurisprudence and city planning into the modern age, prioritizing public safety over corporate convenience. The sweet scent of memory. The physical cleanup and the legal battle were over, but the memory and even the remnants of the disaster lingered. For decades afterward, locals claimed that on hot, humid summer days, the smell of burnt sugar and fermentation still wafted through the streets of the North End. The warmth would temporarily liquefy the microscopic remnants of molasses that had seeped into the cobblestones, soil, and old brickwork near the waterfront, releasing the ghosts of the disaster into the Boston air. The site of the tank was eventually paved over and became part of a city recreational facility. Today, a simple plaque marks the location where the tragedy occurred, a small, quiet tribute to the 21 lives lost to the industrial blunder. The Great Molasses Flood, with its absurd premise and tragic outcome, remains an astonishing footnote in American history. It was a perfect storm of physics, weather, and greed that ironically became the catalyst for modern safety regulation, ensuring that future industrial progress would be built on foundations of steel, not just profit.
Suggested path for remaining narrative. From disaster to doctrine. Chapter 5. The Geography of Grief, approximately 4,000 words. Detailed character studies. Expand on the lives and experiences of individual survivors and victims, illustrating the diverse immigrant community of the North End, Antonio Destasio, the firefighters, the dock workers, and the children. The psychological impact. Examine the trauma on the community. Detail the gruesome, prolonged recovery effort where citizens and soldiers worked side by side in the molasses, and the long-term psychological distress, the smell, the fear, the physical contamination. The funeral processions. Describe the mass funerals and the public display of grief that fueled the community's demand for justice. Chapter 6. The Age of Impunity, approximately 5,000 words. The USIA Corporation. Deep dive into the structure and motivation of the United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA, Company. Contextualize their drive for profit against the backdrop of World War I supply chain chaos and the impending Prohibition deadline, which created extreme pressure to rush production and cut safety measures. Industrial oversight in the Gilded Age. Analyze the complete lack of government regulation and building codes for industrial structures in the early 20th century. This lack of oversight was the true systemic villain. The role of Arthur Gell. Humanize the incompetent supervisor, Gell, showing him as a functionary caught between corporate demands and engineering necessity. Chapters 7 to 10. The Scientific Sleuths and the Courtroom War, approximately 12,000 words. Forensic Engineering. An expanded, detailed look at Professor George F. Swain's pivotal investigation, explaining the science of viscosity, fluid dynamics, and fermentation thermodynamics in layman's terms. This provides the informational core of the story. The Trial Narrative, a dramatic retelling of the 6-year legal battle. Focus on the testimony, the conflicting expert witnesses, and the tactics of the high-powered corporate lawyers versus the attorneys representing the victims. The legal precedent. Detail the significance of Auditor Hugh W. Ogden's final report. How did this case establish the legal principle of foreseeable risk and the obligation of manufacturers to ensure public safety? Chapters 11 to 14. The Regulatory Revolution, approximately 15,000 words. The Aftermath in Boston. Detail the permanent changes to Boston's building department and city codes. The molasses flood became the benchmark for structural safety requirements. National impact. Show how the case influenced nationwide changes in municipal engineering standards and corporate accountability laws. This disaster, through its absurd nature, achieved regulatory change where years of campaigning had failed. The long tale of memory. Conclude with the story's enduring legacy, the faint smell, the historical markers, and the cultural memory that preserved the truth of the event for a USA audience. The narrative would close by emphasizing how this bizarre tragedy led directly to safer structures across America.